30 years ago, I brought a Cub Scout pack to Meadowlark Gardens to view the park. Met there by a gentleman who was just an incredible speaker and entertainer of 10-year-olds, which I was not. But he did such a wonderful job, and so I kept coming back every year for some 30 years to see the magic that he put into the Meadowlark Botanical Gardens Park, which is in Buell Road in Fairfax County. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Charlene for our continuing education for introduction, a proper introduction for you.
It's always great to be around people who have similar interests, right? I loved hearing a little bit about the history of the Master Naturalist program in Virginia. I worked with the Master Gardener program quite a long time ago. When I heard about the Master Naturalist program come along, I said, this is rocking, this is so great, for a couple reasons. One is that Virginia is an incredible state for natural history. You all already know that, and we'll discuss that in a little more detail. And can you hear me okay?
No.
I know I'm not using the mic.
Please use it.
Can you hear me all right? It's my preference. I also just mentioned that I have a pretty substantial hearing deficit. So if we're asking questions, feel free to yell at me. That's just sort of a recent phenomenon. So when Charlene and Barry and I started to talk about what we wanted to do, I was sort of fascinated that they wanted to talk a little bit more about something other than just Virginia. However, as I put the program together, I really wanted to do sort of a regional focus initially. And we'll go to a couple other places in the world that many of you have probably been to. As you'll see in some of the information out there that I've produced over the past 40 years, geography, biogeography is very, very important to me. Other cultures, travel. So I really devoted a lot of resources over the years to traveling in various parts of the world, and it has very much informed me and influenced me as an interpretive naturalist. So just a brief review. I got my start in outdoor education about 1980, 42 years ago. How could that be? And what I was involved primarily in was working as a backcountry leader, like an outbound program in Shenandoah National Park. And so we were doing multi-night trips. We'd come up and do Old Rag. Dare I tell you, in that day and time, we spent the night of the summer. It was incredible. Can't do that anymore, as you know. So multi-day trips, quite a bit of programming in West Virginia, some programming in Colorado, and at the time, rock climbing ruled my life. So that was about 40 years, about 80 pounds ago, so things have changed quite a bit at that time. Plus then, I'm really frightened of heights now. But what happened was, I was visiting these various rock climbing sites around North America and Europe and a few other places. I became progressively interested in the vegetation of the city. And at the same time, I was helping my wife get to college and sort of saw her go through that process. And then I essentially had an epiphany right over here at Weekly Hill on the north side of Old Red. We were sitting up on one of the trips at the time I was working for Montgomery County Public Schools, and a trips, backpacking, all-season backpacking trips, rafting trips, caving, incredible neutralizer with kids, as well as fly fishing. So I sort of coordinated all the field activity for those. So spring of 1982, we're over at Weekly Hollow. We're getting set up in a pretty big group, but we were within our backcountry regulation on our permit. And we were setting up. It was a beautiful day like today. And there were so many wildflowers, I realized we couldn't set up tents without crushing wildflowers. So I just told everybody, I said, no tents tonight, we're just going to bivvy outside. And do not step on any of these wildflowers. That's our objective. And by the way, the core of these programs was low impact camping. So the idea is that every single thing we did, we just left no trace whatsoever. So this sort of fell well within that medium of teaching in that setting. So flowers were okay. We got up and hiked out in the morning. One of the kids came this close to getting skunk. That was sort of fun. But for me, it just changed. That day, that night just changed. And I came home and I told my wife, I said, all right, as soon as you're done with school, I'm going to go to school and I want to study plants. So that's what I did. I was very fortunate to be able to combine a bunch of different work and education. But at the end of the day, I knew that I wanted to work in the natural resource field somewhere, whether it was in just straight conservation, whether it was in biodiversity assessments, whether it was working with living or preserved collections. So long story short, I ended up out of Mission Museum in Honolulu for several years. Our oldest child was born. I was working on a series of NSF grants there, National Science Foundation. And that was primarily with preserved specimens in a big herbarium. It's a big herbarium, almost 1 million specimens. I had the privilege there to work with a number of senior scientists and really got to learn so much. And then started leading trips for the museum to all these wilderness areas in Hawaii, which was really great. So they really were natural history trips, vegetation, birds, geology, and then we did it back here on the East Coast. And I did a little bit of piecework for Rural Wildlife Fund, and then went to work for the Regional Park Authority as a staff naturalist, where Barry was a board member. And then I ended up running Meadowlark Botanical Gardens for about 22 years. So much of my frame of reference is from a public garden and living collections and interpreting those living collections. But however, during that entire time, I've also been a study tour leader for the Smithsonian Associates, on and off, local study tour leaders. So everything from Seneca Rocks and Monongahela National Forest out to Tangier Island, various, different trips. I really tend to be more of a mountain person than I am a coast person. So that's been wonderful work. So I retired a little bit early due to the pandemic, but I'm still working for the Smithsonian on those trips. A month ago this weekend, we were on a trip up to Skyland, and we were hiking around that area, which is great. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We're going to cover a broad spectrum of information today. We're going to touch on some slightly philosophical things. What I hope I can do today is leave you with a number of questions you want to answer, and with the methodology to find the right person to answer that question. So, of course, I looked at your curriculum on the way up, and again, the state of Virginia, I love this. So, Introduction to the Naturalist program, American Naturalist, Basic Ecology, we'll talk about that today, Biogeography, the center of my indoors, Geology, naming, nature of naming, I love that, that's great. Education, interpretation skills, ecology, natural resource management, overview of vertebrates and vertebrates. This is a killer curriculum. Yeah. I mean, this is like so good. You guys all going through this. And by the way, now that I'm old enough, I can take classes for free in the state of Virginia. If there's room, right? But I frankly would like to sit through this curriculum as a refresher, because it's so good. And I loved one other aspect of it. It was on the next page that I didn't take a screenshot of. It said, and if you don't know the answer, it's very important that you find the right person who does. So true. I was in one of my most recent Smithsonian Zoom programs. We were talking about a public garden in Perth, Australia, which is this amazing place, the city, the region. And man, this one guy, I don't know who he was, maybe you're in the audience, had this incredibly loaded, totally technical question about bird evolution in Western Australia. Way out of my wheelhouse. It was easy to answer. I said, I don't know the answer to that, but I can find the person who does. And as a natural history interpreter, we got to remember nature is infinite. Nobody knows everything. There's, however, one small exception in my work experience. I have found that entomologists seem to know almost everything. When you're studying a group of animals with well over 1 million organisms, I mean, and they're all interacting with plants. So if you're really looking for that hard question, and you know where you can find an entomologist, you get them out of their collection for a little bit and ask them some questions. They are a really good research. All right, well with that, let's move forward. So in my experience in interpreting, I really like to move from the macro to the micro. I really like to, and this is the geographer in me. I like to look at the big picture and define that, and then move more to the functions in the ecosystems and those functions. So I always like to foster a sense of place. And by the way, this place, Old Rag, this is sacred ground for me. You know, the first thing I noticed driving up the driveway, that the house was built out of subsurface native stone. That's rare. There are not many houses built out of the super ancient Old Rag granite. It's a really unique thing. So I always think about the big picture and then going to the smaller picture when I'm interpreting for groups. And we'll talk a little more about this, all right? So here's the eastern slope of Dolly Sobs, looking off to the east with the spruce forest and these incredibly perfect cumulus clouds just blowing, fair weather cumulus clouds blowing through. Very interesting shrubland in the lower layer there. And there's an outcrop here at Bear Rock. Does anybody know the Bear Rock outcrop out there? Right, so I often say an outcrop runs through it in my life. It's the Bear Rock outcrop. Because it's this place I've spent so much time in all these different seasons. And, you know, so much of my early interest in the wilderness was all framed in the concept of man against nature. You know, you've got to go out there and endure and hike and climb and what have you. And you never stop to look at anything. You just see how many miles you went. But that changed gradually over time. Thank goodness. Okay. And then to the micro, one of the most important ecological aspects of our ecosystem, really ecosystems around the world, but temperate ecosystems for sure, is the concept of myrmecochory, the science of myrmecochory. That is how ants disperse seeds from almost all of our native wildflowers. You guys have probably already heard about this in a few of your different classes. Naturally, as a young traveler, and I first heard the term myrmecochory, I thought about the picture in the upper right-hand corner, and that it was a village in the west coast of Ireland. So I'm pretty sure I had a beer in myrmecochory once. As it turns out, no, it's much more interesting than that. And there's even an entire plant called Myrmeconium that is native to the lowlands of New Guinea. It's a member of the coffee family, and its entire trunk is swollen as essentially ant house. So this is a really good example of the micro, moving from the macro to the micro. This is just what I've done, and I just want to share that with you. You know what works best for you if you're out teaching and working with people. I tend to interpret from the ground up, so I really tend to think about geology and soil, and then vegetation, birds, wildlife, and obviously weather and climate. And then in this day and age, I don't really think we can interpret natural history without talking about the ultimate naturalist, and that is the native peoples. Now, I remember giving a talk at this big meeting in Barcelona many years ago, and there were all these. I was sort of in a place that I've been in a lot where
where I'm the sole non-academic in the group. And normally what I would say is, please put me in the middle. So if I really screw up, we'll finish strong, we'll start strong. It's sort of funny that we're all vegetation people. We think about vegetation as being that sort of primary source of biodiversity. Well, that only counts until the soil scientist comes in and says, no, man, it's soil. Soil is the basis of vegetation and the basis of biodiversity. Then the geologist comes in and says, no, it's the parent material that ultimately dictates the soil, acidity, and structure. That's the source of terrestrial biodiversity. And then the planetary geologist comes in, and we all feel very lost. So there's sort of this succession of things. I've always been really happy to sort of stick to the idea that vegetation is very much the foundation of terrestrial biodiversity. Many of you have read Doug Tallamy's books, Bringing Home Nature among them, and you know that our native white oak is host to over 250 different organisms. It's a keystone species ecologically. That's a great example of vegetation being foundational to terrestrial biodiversity. So I'm going to stick with vegetation. All right. So what I found over the years, working with a lot of different interpreters, is that most of them seem to have a specialty within an area that they expand out from. Some of you might be big birders, some of you might be into insects, some of you might be into geology, hydrology. You know, in my case, I love plants and botany and biogeography, but I've worked with some naturalists who really don't know that much about plants, or butterflies say, but they know everything about regional geology. Man, can you learn a lot from. And then obviously zoology is a big area to include birds and herpetology. Entomology, of course, a big area. Again, look out for those entomologists that know everything. Ethnobotany has really come into one of its own big areas now. That is the human use of plants for sustenance and for housing and for clothing. The University of Hawaii now has a MS and a PhD program just in ethnobotany. That program is not 30 years old. And also ethnography, really the study of people. So a lot of naturalists out there do come from that one area where they have a concentration and they branch out. I will say this. I think we have one of the great naturalists in North America working in Virginia. His name is Alonzo Abogabas. Any of you guys know Alonzo? I think I've worked with a lot of senior biologists, and I will tell you, Alonzo is one of the most broad spectrum, knowledgeable naturalists that I've ever met. And he was a longtime naturalist with Arlington County and does a lot of master naturalist programs and instruction there. And he is now the natural resource manager there. So we encounter each other now, and he's an extraordinary resource. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this interpretive continuum that interpreters these days are really working on a moving ship. And in some ways, I think the ship is sort of speeding up. I'll talk a little bit about that as we continue to go. But those foundational naturalists in North America and in the world, we obviously all know Darwin and von Humboldt, children of extraordinary privilege with incredible minds and the ability to travel the world, making some of the most foundational discoveries in all of biological science that we still depend on today. And then how about Alfred Russel Wallace? Anybody familiar with him? You want to be familiar with Alfred Russel Wallace? There's a big thing between Australia and Southeast Asia called the Wallace Line. It's incredibly important. Alfred Russel Wallace was a pauper. He was not a child of privilege. He went and collected specimens for natural history collections. One of his greatest collections from Amazonia sunk in a ship on the way back to the UK. Everything he collected was gone. One important thing about Wallace, he wrote Darwin a letter. He said, I have this theory. I think that there's a lot of interrelation in things in nature, and I think they're changing over time. Wallace wrote Darwin this letter. But guess what happened? Darwin wrote him back and said, I'm going to send you some cash, and I want you to come back to London and be part of this presentation I'm going to make at the Royal Geographic Society. Good for Darwin. He didn't shut Wallace out. He considered him meaningful and brought him under his umbrella. So I was always impressed with that. And then my other favorite little-known naturalist in North America, William Clarke Slade of York. Think about York. There's a picture of him depicted with the bandans out west. The first person of African origin that probably almost any Native Americans ever saw. If I could be a fly on a wall and just watch something like this happen. And William Clarke was essentially a Daniel Boone type character. He was a woodsman. He was with Meriwether Lewis, who was really the trained naturalist on the expedition. But York became very rapidly known as his own skilled naturalist, his own skilled woodsman, his own skilled observer. He somehow had, is reputed to have been faster to have learned some of Sacagawea's language on the trip. He was this extraordinary figure in history and also in natural history. And this depicts the man dance with York with his shirt off, where he was, by the way, greeted as semi-divine in many of these Native American communities. And they kept rubbing his skin. I said, dude, how can this be? And so he was this incredible figure, and somebody I just love to think about. And then many of you may not have heard of Lucy Braun, certainly Rachel Carson. How about Rosalind Franklin? Anybody familiar with her? She was right in on the inner circle of the Botany Clarke, defining the genetic code. She was the third scientist on the team who was not honored with the Nobel, and she should have. An incredible person. We are rapidly evolving into a molecular age of natural history. We're going to talk about this a little bit. Rosalind Franklin was a person who was central to that. Lucy Braun is probably one of the great botanists and forest ecologists of her time. She wrote this Deciduous Forest of Eastern North America, published in the 50s. It has this incredible map in it. She was an extraordinary floristic botanist spent most of her career, I think, at the University of Cincinnati. She was really the first person to describe in great detail the forests that we have here. Another thing that she did, which I loved, is she not only asked, what are the species in the forests that we have today, but where do they come from? What's the migrational history? This is something I absolutely love to talk about. And me and the other 15 people in the world get together occasionally and discuss it. Because it's very interesting. And everybody knows Rachel Carson's extraordinary work. That's Lucy Braun there in the white blouse. And then most of you are going to know Edward O. Wilson, recently deceased, and Jared Diamond, author and Pulitzer Prize winner for the landmark book Guns, Germs, and Steel. More recently, one of Jared Diamond's understudies, Yuval Harari, the Israeli historian based at the University of Tel Aviv, and he had wrote the books Sapiens, which really put him on the map. He is an extraordinary thinker of the broader spectrum of human agency and natural history. And then my two favorite women scientists, just most recently, Jennifer Doudna at Berkeley and Emmanuelle Charpentier at the Max Planck Institute. What they just do. Science news is important for naturalism. They won the Nobel Prize last year for their work on CRISPR, which is the gene editing tool. Man, oh man, oh man. This work, in my humble estimation as a regular old-time interpretive naturalist, is profound in its positive implications and its potentially negative implications. But it is an extraordinary illustration of how our world, our science world, our natural history world, is moving from organismal biology to molecular biology. My oldest daughter is a resident physician in New York City. She was undergraduate at the University of Oklahoma, and I remember she called me He said, Dad, I'm taking a zoology course. Oh, I'm so excited. You know, see all that stuff I told you about when you were a kid? It wasn't that boring. You know, what are you studying? And she goes, we're studying the cell morphology in the lower quadrant of a chipmunk esophagus. And I'm like, that's physiology. That's not zoology. Zoology is about organisms. Well, little did I know that zoology is changing along with all the other biological sciences. It's becoming much more focused on a molecular level. I'm an old-time naturalist. I want to know where that chipmunk poops. I want to know what the gestation period is. I want to know the length of the skull. I want to know how many ribs it has. You know, so that's sort of what I'm looking at. And if you're a natural history interpreter, that's what you need to know. You don't need to know too much at this juncture about the cell morphology in the lower portion of its esophagus. Clearly, the class didn't hurt her, but I'm a little flabbergasted. All right. So, and the overall theme today is the state of landscape ecology and biogeography. I don't read slides because everybody can read slides, but this is the notion of landscape ecology is increasingly important. And we in the state of Virginia, our state ecologists, I would argue that is one of the great ecologists working in North America today, Gary Fleming. We have a few of his pictures in this show. So Gary's a terrestrial vegetation ecologist, and so he contributed to the Flora of Virginia, this might, which many of you have, which really should have been 2 volumes. The part of the Flora of Virginia for me that I love the most, and I'm going to bet that you like the most, are the introductory chapters. It talks about the physical environment in Virginia. And then there's a tour of like the best places in the state to go in botany. The rest of the book is hardcore systematic botany, running keys. It always amazed me that this book was published less than 10 years ago. Here we are in the home of the only naturalist president, Thomas Jefferson, and we can have our own flora. West Virginia had a flora, North Carolina had a flora, Pennsylvania had a flora, there was even a flora of DC. No flora of Virginia. So this was a major accomplishment. The senior author, Alan Weekly, I'm on his Facebook feed. Wow. I don't know how any one person can know so much. But we can be very proud of our flora of Virginia. It's a superb, superb book. It's probably the preeminent science book that's ever been written on any particular topic in the state. It's a great piece of work. We'll come back and talk a little bit about that. So let's remember this concept of landscape ecology. This really dictates a lot of the work that the Virginia Department of Natural Heritage does. Okay? So let's get the local perspective. There's our fabulous, our fabulous dogwood, which, you know, how can you beat that for a great native plant? Dogwood on the left and redwood on the right. And lo and behold, there it is, lurking below the clouds. It's a very rare phenomenon to see the higher peaks of Shenandoah with a fog bank, although I saw it last month when it was Smithsonian. Okay? So I mentioned that I still like to interpret from the ground up. So one of the first things I always talk about with groups is, you know, what's the historical geology of the region? Why does the region look like it does? For us, it's fairly succinct. It was a collision between North Africa and Europe and the Shenandoah or the Appalachian orogeny. But there is a big difference. With our favorite mountain out here, Old Rag, is actually from a different, much older orogeny called the Grenfell orogeny, which was massive, extremely ancient. And lo and behold, we have a big chunk of it here in Virginia. And I would say that Old Rag, when I think about Old Rag, I think it's one of the most exciting mountains to hike east of the Mississippi. No question about it. It ranks with Mount Katahdin and Mount Washington and the big peaks in the southeast. And that's probably the reason you have to have a permit then, right? It's just started this year. And my view over the past 50 years that I've been visiting Old Rag, I started as a kid, it used to sort of be way out in the country. It's not that far out in the country anymore. It's almost more like an urban River Park. And I was wondering for years when they were going to instill a permit program. So we haven't. But anyhow, historical geology, I think, is extremely important as we look at landscapes. And if we look at the entirety of Shenandoah, all in the Rappahannock and the Potomac Valley, Potomac watershed, an extraordinary watershed. So I think that the thing that I did at Meadowlark that to me was the most critical thing that happened while I was there, when I arrived there, from an interpretive standpoint, it was purely an ornamental garden. Purely. Daylilies, hosta, some goofy hybrid conifers, you know, and I told my bosses, I said, this has to change. Well, what has to change? I said, you've got to have a cogent conservation mission in this garden. Well, how are we going to do that? How much is it going to cost? And I said, what we're going to do is we're going to build a native plant collection. We'll start tomorrow. Start putting native plants in the ground. But it has to be highly specified. I don't want to come across another native plant collection that says, let's plant to the mid-Atlantic. That's just not defined enough for me. So what I said is, I want to create a collection of plants for the native flora that's found in the Potomac River Basin. We cover a couple of interpretive strategies there. We talk about a river system, we talk about water quality, we talk about topography, we talk about geology, we talk about vegetation. It draws lay people into a broad spectrum group of topics. And this was a huge success. It brought in about $700,000 in direct gifts over a space of 20 years. Conservation sells. If you're in the business of working in a conservation setting, people want to give you money for well-defined conservation projects. Lo and behold, much to my amazement, in 2022, the collection's given an award for its creation from the Bones Hill Wildflower Preserve up in Pennsylvania, which is the preeminent wildflower public garden in North America. Many collaborators on that project, and I was careful to thank them all in a post online. And so Meadowlark fundamentally changed. Suddenly, we had a specific conservation mission. Not only was it a beautiful place, but it was a significant place. And that completely changed the framework of the garden as a public garden. Several years later, we launched a holiday light show. It was not my wheelhouse at all. It was just brutal the first couple of years. Well, here's what happened. Many people came to the light show that had never been to the garden and came back to see the garden. So it really paid off. And plus that, it became one of the few public gardens in the country that ran completely in black. So it was and is hugely successful. All right. And look at the river basins of Virginia. You can't get a cooler state than this. Big river basins, complex, you know, going from sea level all the way up well above 5,000 feet at Mount Rogers. Just, you know, an amazing state to live and work in. Someday, I hope that, remember how kids learned about the watershed they lived in? So most kids around here know that they live in the Chesapeake watershed. I would love someday for kids to know what river basin they live in. Yeah, I live in Rappahannock, I live in the James River Basin, I live in the Potomac River Basin. And this applies further. What about ecoregions? I'm a big ecoregion enthusiast because they are so closely connected to the science of biogeography. How about every kid in grade school learns what ecoregion they live in? It's not a specifically regional thing. There are ecoregions all over the earth, and they have been mapped all over the earth, principally by World Wildlife Fund and by Conservation International. We just missed one there, but there you go. North America. So I did a big road trip last year to visit my youngest daughter, who's an Outward Bound leader in California. I visited 22 ecoregions. I didn't care about the states. I wanted to visit the ecoregions, so that's what we did. It was a great thing to be able to do. All right. So in my Shenandoah programs, we'll zoom in online, and these are just sort of the broad topics that I cover, as you can see, and as we just sort of move through. I really do talk about recreation because of its impact and its use. It's very important that as naturalists we can interpret the human impact on a particular area, whether it's big or little. Maps are always front and center with everything I do to try to really give people an orientation. I am amazed. On my Yosemite trip last month, a month ago this weekend, we had 4 or 5 people of the 25 attendees, no, maybe like 10. That had never been to Shenandoah. I'm like, how did you live in Washington for 40 years and never visit the park? How
I've
did
only
you do
been
that?
one time.
But it has. So I think it's important when we think about ourselves as naturalists, we are informal educators. This is beautiful stuff. So you're going to find most of your naturalists at the institutions at the top, museums, zoos, aquaria, botanic gardens, often interpreting living collections, living landscapes, always conservation focused. And then sometimes, the public school teachers will come to us and say, here's my SOL. Can you please design a field trip that will cover these SOLs? Right on, we can do that. And then always remember your formal educators, your classroom teachers, your university faculty, they're tied to a curriculum, they're taking tests. And, interesting note, we talked a little bit about E.O. Wilson. Look on his website, which is still up and going and being added to. Years ago, he stated that in North America, annually, every year, more people visit zoos, aquaria, and botanical gardens than all professional and amateur sporting events combined. Why was he stating this? Because he is a big proponent of the biophilia hypothesis. That is, that humans are in love with nature. It's in our genes. It comes from the fact that only a few thousand years ago, all of our ancestors were egalitarian hunter-gatherers. And that still drives us today to interact with the natural world. A lot more literature on that. It's really interesting, called the biophilia hypothesis. And Ed Wilson was really the father of that. Well, I have to show some lady slipper work pictures for a couple of reasons. Because they're great to interpret. So the yellow lady slipper, Cypripedium calceolus on the side here, you can actually buy that in trade. It's propagatable. A really sophisticated grower can propagate that and sell it to you. And if you're a pretty sophisticated gardener and put together just the right soil profile, you might get it to grow in your garden. Alternatively, pink lady slipper cannot be propagated. It's never been propagated. All orchids have cells that are unicellular, they're microscopic. I like the fact that our species writes symphonies, builds computers, is on the verge of AI, builds spaceships. We went to the moon decades ago, but we can't propagate pink lady slipper. Now, the first person who does propagate a pink lady slipper in mass, and then it shows up at all our local nurseries, so we can put as many of them as we want in our garden, will probably be richer than Bill Gates. Because isn't gardening the first or second most active avocation in North America? I know I'd go out and buy them if I could, but it's very curious. So there are these elements of nature that we have no clue how to manipulate yet. But that could be changing with the advent of CRISPR, of gene editing. That might be one of the first things that will happen. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay. So this was my classroom. Man, I love that. My classroom was a 100-acre space with 3 lakes and a big native plant collection. This was an art class that came out every year in the spring. This is the main lake at Meadowlark Botanical Gardens. What an extraordinary privilege to do we have any classroom teachers with us today? What do you teach? English. And what age? Oh, excellent. Cool. When I began to realize this, I spent some time in classrooms a little bit, with my time at Montgomery County Public Schools as an assistant. But, when I went out and wandered around Meadowlark, I went, oh my God, this is my classroom. quick, let's get some kids in here. But I did have, something happened to me as an interpreter, and this is important. Almost my whole career, I specialized in high school students, college students, adults, and seniors. A group of kindergartners would show up, and I'd just melt. Oh, don't let them get close. I don't want to get close to them. You know, I'm not a storyteller. And then one day, there was just this change. This change just came over me, and I had this tremendously learning colleague, Bill Folsom. A couple of his images are in here. We worked together on a lot of stuff. He was a retired spy. He knew all these different things. And I said, Bill, you know, this is the oddest thing. I'm watching these kindergarten and preschool classes come in, and I just want to go out there and do a program for them. And he looks at me and goes, you know what's happening, right? I said, I don't have a clue. I had no clue. Everybody know what he told me? That you're old enough to be a grandparent. I would never have made that connection my entire life unless Bill had told me. And I'm a grandparent. And so I started, this was only like 5 or 6 years ago. And I started doing programs for little kids. And the first time I was out there telling a story about a rabbit in the grass that I was making up on the fly, and those 2 little hands slipped into my hands walking down the trail. I'm like, oh my God, this is so magical. No college student, no senior citizen held my hand. I was pretty pumped about this. And I am today. I still am. I'm like, I told my former colleagues, I said, I'll come in and do story time at camp, just because I love being around the kids. So you change as an interpreter over time as this kind of stuff happens to you. There's another one of my principal classrooms, the summit of Old Rag, or the summit of Old Rag, looking at the summit. Look how well we can see Hawksbill in the distance. And the big meadow is massive down on the left. One of the most incredible examples of intrusive granite on Earth, literally in our backyard here. I cannot count the times I've been up there with students over the years, mainly adventure education, some natural history education. The last time I hiked Old Rag was in mid-March of 2014. The next day I got on a plane to North Africa. And I walked off that plane like this. I mean, I was so sore I could barely walk. You know, and I realized that, you know, my mind is writing checks these days that my body can't count. This keeps happening more and more often to me. All right. But I straightened up. Great little picture there, the ridge trail coming up. By the way, there were some very interesting rock climbs developed on those lower slabs in the late 70s. I was part of sort of an extended group that worked on that. So really good rock climbing up there now. Okay. So one of the interesting things, anybody come across the term monadnock? Anybody been up on, anybody been to Mount Monadnock in New Hampshire or Sugarloaf out in Frederick County in Maryland? So these are, a monadnock is defined geologically, it's a Native American term, and it basically referred to a nipple-like or a lone mountain. It's sort of by itself. It's not part of the ridge. It's out by itself. Well, it's now a technical geologic term. It's a pretty good Scrabble word. The King is worth 5, the M is worth 3. So my question, a question I want to ask a local geologist is Old Rag a monadnock? It's a different geologic makeup than the volcanics on Skyline Drive, and it stands alone. So I'm curious about that. I think it is a monadnock, but I'm going to wait for the authority on that. Okay. So here's just a picture of the Trail of Old Rag. I'm going to point out 2 things here. One is, you know what one of my favorite outings is here? It's actually not Old Rag, it's Mount Robertson. If you've not been to the summit of Mount Robertson there, you see Corbin Hollow, and then the Mount Robertson Trail in the upper left-hand corner. You want to go to the summit of Mount Robertson. It has the most commanding view in the world. And it's very steep. Looking down on the north face of Old Rag. You could be in the Scottish Highlands. I mean, it's just amazing, the verticality and the bulk of Old Rag. The most interesting thing I think I ever did with Old Rag, back in the summer of the fall of 1978, out with a friend of mine training for a trip out west. Total, cold, snowy ice. And we went up and we did this ridge to the summit and spent the night about there. And I don't know if people have been there before or after. It was extremely remote and really, really interesting. So, you know, Old Rag is just, it's an extraordinary place from start to finish. All right? So, you know, just to think about geology, looking at the, you know, idealized geologic time on the left. So, you know, the Cenozoic is the period that has been most important to me in my career as an interpreter, from the Paleocene up through the Holocene being the present. Okay, so the scientific community has said we have a new Cenozoic epoch. Everybody know what it is? The Anthropocene. Right? Years ago, the Bishop Museum talked about this with friends of mine 30 years ago. We thought it should be called the Homogeny, because humans are blending everything together. The Anthropocene is really is the term now. We're going to talk a little bit about implications for the Anthropocene as we move forward. One of my favorite books on geology along Skyline Drive by Robert Badger. I've never met him, but he seems to be an authority on the geology of Skyline Drive. It's a superb book. Basically works by going from site to site and explaining the geology as you're looking at it. He took me to task in a review on one of my Smithsonian programs on the natural history of Shenandoah because I was a few million years off on one profile. You know what? You put yourself out there, that happens, that's okay. You can correct it, you learn, and move on. That's what I did. All right? I think one of the most important things for interpreting natural history in this area is the last ice age, which was so recently. The 18,000 years ago was the Glacial Maximum. Now, for those of you that work in the technology field, I want you to know, I'm a little disappointed. You've not invented a time machine yet. Doggone it, I want to go back to the Glacial Maximum, to this exact spot, and see what it looks like. There's no ice here. The glacier didn't make it. It was up in northern Pennsylvania, New York, New England. It created the Great Lakes. You can sort of see it there in the lower right of the image, with that portion of the Laurentide ice sheet. What an extraordinary thing. But here's what we do know, is that all of these mountains probably looked a whole lot like they look now. 18,000 years is a grain of sand in geologic time. We would recognize every one of the big summits. Old Rag, Hawksville, they all look pretty much like they do now. But we don't have any forest on. Time sort of cool. And then down in the deepest valleys, it would be a red and black spruce forest. So it would actually look a lot like parts of Labrador and Newfoundland and parts of northern New England today. And it tells us, of course, that plants migrate. And then the other question is, well, what the heck happened to all the species that are here now? Well, during the Glacial Maximum, they all migrated down to the southeastern United States where they found refuge, called a refugia. And bear in mind, sea level was much, much, much lower than it is now. And Florida was twice its current width. Florida was this massive peninsula covered mostly in species that we recognize here today. This is very recent and very profound. It shows us how the environment changes over time, over long periods. We just get to see a tiny little picture of it because of our lifespan. So there we are. Look at the approximate outline. No Chesapeake Bay, huge Floridian Peninsula, big Sierran glaciers, and man, oh man, what a change that was. So even though we weren't glaciated here, it profoundly changed the environment. Profoundly changed the environment. Another thing I like to look at is just, some of the common trees. Trees just introduce us so much, tell us so much. And we have this incredible selection of oaks in Virginia, very diverse oaks. I love number 9, the bur oak, one of the biggest acorns in the world. Acorns are the diagnostic feature for oak trees, along with their buds. But you really need to have a good hand lens to really look at the bud carefully. But they all have that distinct imbricate cap or distinct imbricate bud, overlying scales, and tremendous insight. Lucy Braun called our forest an oak hickory woodland. And that's pretty much what it is, because we have a big diversity of oaks. We have a diversity of hickories along with many other interesting trees. So, you know, I love the fact that in Virginia, you can go down to Virginia Beach to First Landing State Park. And what's native down there? Spanish moss. Spanish moss. And it's furthest northerly south. And then we can go up to these high summits right here, and what's native up there? Red spruce. At one of their furthest southerly summits. They go all the way down to the Smokies, because it gets higher and higher. We lose about 3.2 degrees for every 1,000 feet in elevation. So it's supposed to be like 55 here tonight. It's going to be cold on top of Hospital tonight. I can't believe that. I heard 58 in DC. That means it's going to be much cooler here. So pretty amazing to think about. So 3.2 degrees. You get up to Dolly Sox. That's at 4,200 feet, 1,200 meters. It's going to be very cold there tonight. In the old days, they said that you could almost get a freeze any time of year at Dolly Sox. I find that a little hard to believe. But if it's going to be in the mid-50s here tonight, it's going to be seriously cold there tonight. So the change in elevation is huge, and it does dictate tree growth. So think about that, how the Ice Age affected Virginia, because it's profound, even though we weren't glaciated. And then, of course, invasive species. Man, this is a big and concerning issue. As you all know, I've got a lot of you who've done time pulling weeds for your hours. This is an illustration of the Anthropocene that could barely be more stark. So what's happening in the foreground here on the right, there are two things that are happening ecologically, really three. So probably most of you recognize the plant at the bottom of the picture. Yes. Japanese stiltgrass. Do you know that Japanese stiltgrass was not in the flora of Virginia 40 years ago? It was not recorded in the flora of Virginia 40 years ago. How did this happen? It almost certainly happened. Somebody just doing their job at like the international market or world market and unpacking some porcelain goods from China or Japan, which happened to be packed in my prestige with the Vivian. And they took the box out to the dumpster that night and threw it in the box and threw it in the dumpster. The wind blew that night, bang. Seeds are out, and we can now get a monoculture of Japanese stiltgrass. One thing about Japanese stiltgrass that's profoundly important for us to know, and most of you already know, it's quite shade tolerant, just like English ivy. If we have a severe weed that is shade tolerant, there's trouble in rivers. We got a problem. And Japanese stiltgrass is unbelievable. Here's the second thing that's happening in this photograph. A little harder to see. But notice the proliferation of pawpaw trees. Pawpaw trees are becoming much more prolific. Botanically, an incredibly interesting plant. Why are they becoming more prolific? It's warmer? Could be. The principal reason is so deer are not browsing on them. Crush the leaf of a pawpaw tree. It smells like, to me, it smells like diesel fuel. Deer don't touch it. And as you already know, it's the largest indigenous fruit in North America, north of Mexico. Incredible. Sort of the mix between an apple and a banana from a distinctly tropical family, the Annonaceae family, the Annona family. You might go to a fancy store. You can do that now in Sperryville, by the way. You couldn't do that before. In the old days, you weren't getting a fancy cup of coffee in Sperryville. Totally changed. But in the old days, you might go to Sperryville and buy some pawpaws in the fall. That whole family is from the tropics. And if you go to one of these fancy stores, you might see a custard apple. That's a pawpaw relative. And it tastes a lot like a pawpaw. So the pawpaws are becoming much more numerous in their riverine habitats. And then in the far distance, we see Polystichum acrosticoides are very common, very robust native Christmas fern. That probably almost has the gumption to fight Japanese stiltgrass. We'll see. But this is a dynamic situation. It is changing. So we got to talk about native peoples a little bit. I want to make sure I'm not taking up too much time this afternoon. So I think it's critically important that we interpret as much as we can about native peoples in the regions where we're working. And because here's what as a cursory observer, this is what appears to be happening. The peopling of the Americas appears to be undergoing a very dramatic, argumentative revision. And for a long, long time, paleoanthropologists were really led to the Clovis theory, the theory of coming over from Beringia during the Ice Age. There's an ice-free corridor down into North America. Certain stone workings are consistent with the Clovis, and it was the dictum. No one ever questioned it. That's changing. And one of the areas that's causing that change is the Meadowlark Cave in Pennsylvania, which might date to 19,000 years before present, to the Glacial Maximum. The other really incredible find, and I invite you to look this up online, the Wendover Find in Florida, not too far from Orlando, just found like 25, 30 years ago. It was a burial area in an acidic bog where there were many, many people found. One is that people were living to a ripe old age in their mid-30s in this community. There was a 14-year-old with spinal deafness, which means that this community had time to take care of that child. That someone was assigned to that child full time, so they had plenty to eat. These were not egalitarian hunter-gatherers. These were probably more established sedentary native peoples, all the way down to Florida, 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. So, and then there are big things happening in South America about paleo-humans. We can't go into detail in here because it's huge, but look it up. It's amazing. Look at, there's all kinds of new theories that are coming up from some very esteemed academics that talk about the peopling of the Americas and South America in particular. The picture on the left there is the burial at Wendover, the bottom one there, where they were actually, so they did not like the northern European acid bogs where the bodies were perfectly preserved. This bog was near subtropical for much of its existence, so the bodies rotted away, but the bones were very well preserved. Just in the broadest sense, as interpreters, we all need to know who the Paleo-Indians were, we need to know who the Archaic Indians were, we need to know who the Woodland Indians were. It's very, very important to this part of North America for native people. So I'll just say that there, and much of it is connected with spear point technology. But mind you, when the first Europeans encountered the Woodland Indians of Virginia down and what is now Norfolk and West Point, Virginia, they encountered a pretty sophisticated group of people. There was agriculture, there was spirituality, there was sedentary existence, there were forming confederacies. Linguistically, it was really diverse. This was just not Europeans rolling up and finding hunter-gatherers running around the woods. There was art, there was music. It was a pretty remarkable thing. And it looks like the mound-building peoples of the Mississippi area, northern Mississippi, into Ohio, Indiana, were particularly sophisticated native peoples, and nobody seems to know much about that. More is coming out on. So read up on this. It's endlessly fascinating. And then we just have a couple of images from John White. He sailed on a couple of the first really early images here. We have the Indian village. Notice the shared longhouses and the ramada here where the kids would hang out and chase deer out of the crops. Hunters here with bows and arrows. Religious ceremonies taking place at the bottom there. This was an active place. Sunflower, squash, beans being grown, what they sort of call the Mexican Trinity, corn, beans, and squash. We know that corn came from Central America. So somehow there was a trading network that brought corn to this part of the world, and nobody knows when. And many of these images are from the Albemarle Sound area, because that's where White happened to be. This is one of my favorite colorized images of a Native American hunter of the region with this very fine bow, probably made of arrowwood, the type of viburnum. He has a very cool body ornamentation, but this was not tattoos. Tattoos are a phenomenon of the Pacific peoples. But the body ornamentation was probably semi-temporary and was probably founded on elderberry and some other really deeply colored items. And then he has this deerskin skirt, which is very interesting, along with this quiver. So, and as White did and all the European artists did at the time, they drew the face to look like Europeans. They're not Europeans, these were people of Asian ancestry. And he has these curious feathers on his head. Any guess on what the feathers stood for? It's gotta be you guys. Come on, what do you think?
I was thinking turkey.
Turkey, like turkey feathers? Highly likely. Well, most people think it's a societal rank. It's much simpler than that. It's probably turkey feathers or hawk feathers with a dab of pitch pine on the end, which you stick to your ears and stick up in your hair, because insects go to the highest point on your body. Pretty easy. Notice the tail on a deerskin skirt. You're walking down a trail, the tail's going boom, 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 knocking those black flies off your face. So these guys were some industrious and fascinating people. Another really good reason to get that time machine up and running. All right. This is new, called nativelands.ca. This is an entirely new thing where my youngest daughter's a geography major at Berkeley, and she was scolding me for not knowing various new things. This is one of them, which sort of tells you where some of the prominent tribes were all over North America. This is just our show. So the Kaluga folks up top there, not far from here, the Gonahoaks. I lived down near the Pamunkey and the Chickahominy there for a while. So very diverse. Pocomoke, the Yakima. These groups were culturally and probably close to within the same linguistic family, but those were probably really diverse families, I would assume. But this map covers all of North America, so it's pretty cool. You can see it online. All right. And then I just want to jump back to the Glacial Maximum for a minute. You know, it's like, how can we tell what plants were growing during the Glacial Maximum? The way to do it is through cores. So you might see like ice cores on a National Geographic program. If you can put a core down in a boggy swamp area, bring that core back up, dry it out, and look at the pollen in there. And it's called pollen rain or a pollen record, and it can tell you what plants were most prolific at the time. If people do a core of this area 10,000 years from now and its vegetation's changed, they're going to find that this was an oak hickory woodland. You do a core today from 10,000 years ago, you're going to find that it was primarily grassland and spruce trees. The cores are so pollen as a whole, in the science of paleontology, is a whole fascinating place all unto itself. All right? So we sort of get to our what we see today, with really 85% of the flora, of northern affinity, about 15% what we call neotropical affinity, and the current climate change regime begins, and Virginia begins to look a whole lot like it looks now. But mind you, there are a lot of ecologists out there that will tell you that at this time, a squirrel could go from the western shore of the Chesapeake to the Mississippi River and never touch the ground. Is the forest really that consistent? I don't know, but it's sort of an amazing thought. And our fabulous Shenandoah today, clear evidence of human activity in the distance, farming and deforesting, but what a beautiful place still. All right. So I want to move on and this is a little shorter than the first part of our program, because you guys are, of course, Virginia Master Naturalists. But I want to look a little bit at the Everglades, and then we'll go to South Africa for a little bit too. So let's, the Everglades was a very important place for me in my training. I was able to do a senior project there, and as an undergraduate, so we can go to the next slide. Well, look, Florida also has all its own really interesting ecoregions. I worked as a consultant on this group, the Smithsonian Guides to Natural America. That was a lot of fun. So at the time, I was the primary caregiver for my oldest daughter, who's 28 now. I did that for 2 years. It was the hardest job I've ever had. The hardest job. But I got to keep my feet wet because I was an editorial retainer with SI Press. And it was great to be able to do that. These were being written by travel writers, so they just wanted natural history folks to read through and make sure that a duck wasn't, called a goose or whatever. So that worked well. So Florida, really interesting. Of course, I wanted to go as far as possible down to the tropics, so the Everglades was the place to go. And the Everglades has all its own really interesting ecosystems that are fascinating to interpret. And it is, of course, totally and completely associated in its relationship with embayments and ocean saline water, but also fresh water that is migrating from the northern portions of the Everglades, mainly from Lake Okeechobee. So the Everglades is incredibly delicate because of that freshwater, brackish, saltwater mix. That dictates all vegetation. And you can see here, you can sort of see that, what they call the river of grass flowing out of there, in the central part of the park, down toward Florida Bay. And here's what it looks like from a plane. No wonder the place is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's just, it is truly, truly unique. It reminds me a little bit of a few places I've spent time in Africa. Thank goodness it's a national park. It still has a long way to go to restore a lot of its water flow, but that's one of the principal interpretive things for natural history interpreters in the Everglades, is to interpret why that water flow is so important. And there are these ultra dry, the Everglades has these slightly elevated areas called the pine rocklands, which are a fire climax community. In other words, the pine cones have to be exposed to extreme heat in order to germinate, just like fire climax communities out west. When you see these big fires burning out west, that is a fire climax community. That area was ecologically evolved to do what it's doing. It's just doing it more severely and more frequently now than it should be, than it would have in the past. But the pinelands burn every year. It's very interesting, and it's very beautiful and exotic. And then you can go to the next slide. And then you go down to the hardwood, the tropical hammocks, and the hardwoods are these little pockets of Caribbean biodiversity in extreme southern Florida, with a ton of really interesting plants, the vast majority of which are native to the greater Caribbean basin. And the mangrove forest. The mangroves are incredibly important. Mangroves were just considered weed trees. They're in the way, let's burn them, let's get rid of them. Now we know that mangroves all over the world help mollify hurricanes, storm surge. They help disperse salinity. They are habitat for innumerable crustaceans, small fish, medium-sized fish. Mangroves are incredibly important plants. These are red mangroves, which are the outermost reach of the mangroves. And man, oh man, talk about invasive species. Everglades it's got it all to include these giant snakes and lizards, African apple snails, weeds and trees. It's a very severe problem, and it's gotten worse, particularly since Hurricane Andrew. Hurricane Andrew came ashore in 1992, I believe it was, or 91, destroyed all of these ornamental plant farms and orchid houses, and guess what it did? It blew them out into the Everglades. And many of those plants just naturalized there. The other problem is pet trade animals being released. Very cool article, it just came out in National Geo a while ago. They have found that bobcats, which are numerous in the Everglades, are preying on the snake eggs. That's a good thing. And my last trip to the Everglades in January, I saw a bobcat. I've been waiting my whole adult life to see a bobcat. And I was on this road looking for a couple of birds, called Bear Lake Road, and way down in the distance I see this animal. I'm like, oh, it must be a fox. And then it gets a little closer, and I'm like, oh, it's a Florida panther. And I'm like, I've seen one of the 300 Florida panthers. I can't believe they put this on Facebook. It's all going very much. And then he gets closer, and he goes, whoop, and I can see he's not big enough, and he gives me a profile, and there's that little bobtail on the back. So I back up and just hang out for a little while, and he disappears into the bush. And then I walk down and try to see where he is. Can't see him. I walk about 25 meters back, I turn around, and there he is sitting in the road just staring at me. We look at each other for about 5 minutes, and it just filled my heart, because I've always wanted to see a bobcat. They're all right around us here, but it's a very secretive animal. And I just love the idea that, we have bobcats in this region. By the way, mountain lions were reported here routinely during pre-colonial times, and by the colonists were almost certainly hunted out. That's one reason deer are such a problem. And of course, people say, well, man, let's reintroduce the mountain lion. There's a problem. Mountain lions don't differentiate between toddlers and fawns. Very dangerous animals. You hear about mountain lion attacks out west almost every year. Just think about that cool house cat at home if you weigh 250 kilos. It's a big kitty cat. Very scary. All right. But this is one of the coolest aspects of the Everglades is the backcountry. Canoeing into what they call the wilderness waterway. Really an incredible place. And so this is how you camp. This is called a chickie. I was solo my night out here, and I'm in my $180 Dick's Sporting Goods kayak. I got a couple of looks like, what are you doing back here in that kayak? Well, it floats. It's okay. I'm going to go to the next slide. And so I didn't have the one super wildlife setting here. I was just, of course, looking for wading birds and stuff. It's a very remote area. And all of a sudden, there's this sound. It sounds like the creature from the Black Lagoon. For those of you who are old enough to remember those movies. But it was a striped dolphin. And he's coming through the area, which is only about 2 meters deep. And you can watch him go around the perimeter of the lagoon as the fish are jumping out trying to get away from him. And then you'll see that dorsal fin come up, and you'll see that blowhole come up and go, and take this big breath. And I thought, man, I should have been a marine biologist. This makes plants look really boring. But I don't think I quite had the chops for that. But it's an incredible place for a backcountry trip. Needless to say, you want to go in January or February. This is bug country. And the mosquitoes are still pretty bad. Okay. And then I just love this. Look, there's Rock Creek Pass. It's the highest elevation in the Everglades. 3 feet. And another important thing about the Everglades, it is built entirely on a relatively young group of outcrops, not really outcrops, but flat geologic terraces called oolitic limestone, essentially ancient reefs. So the soil is very limey, but it's a really integral part of the soil. Is very, very thin in the Everglades, and oolitic limestones are very important. Okay, so let's go to South Africa for just a little bit. Okay, anybody been in the Cape Province? The Cape Town area? So I'm headed back to South Africa in a few months, and I'm eager to get there because it's going to be spring for them. So that's going to be sort of cool. And the Cape Province is really extraordinary. The Cape Province has some of the biggest concentration of unique plants in the world. Now we find this on islands, Canaries, the term endemism, so finding animals and plants that are native only to that location. Hey, look at that. It's a barksdale, isn't it? That, by the way, is a very cool family of birds called the Apodiforms. Notice that their feet are completely reduced. They're tiny because they're jet fighters. They're out on insects. They have no time for feet to get in the way of flight. The feet are very, very tiny. Apodiform without feet. Very cool group of birds. So the Cape Province is incredible from an interpretive standpoint. Okay? It's all about endemism, and so much of it has to do with the interaction of the atmosphere and the geology. This is sandstone and granite combined in the Cape Province, where all of these spectacular plants are native and only native there. And what makes it truly unique is that it's not a continent, it's not an island. But climatically, it sort of is an island. Takajan, one of my favorite botanists in the world, wrote Floristic Regions of the World. And he really did a lot of work. He categorized all of these different floras around the world, and it was very instructive to me building the native plant collection at Meadowlark. But, you know, so the real terms here are floristic. What's growing there? What's the composition? Why is it there? Indigenous. So it's native, but it's found in other places. White oaks, red oaks are indigenous here, but they're found up and down the eastern seaboard. If it's endemic, it's only found here. Virginia has one endemic tree. And it's a little tiny birch down near Blacksburg. And it might not even be the species that it was described as years ago. It might have changed, but just one. So big continental areas. It's cosmopolitan. Things mix. Islands, things are super interesting. By the way, I'm looking for somebody who might be interested in going to Madagascar in late September. And once you get to South Africa, it's pretty easy to get to. So endemism is extremely important for this kind of stuff. And needless to say that conservation in these areas is critical, because when it goes extinct, it's nowhere else in the world. Think about the dodo. The dodo was endemic to the island of Mauritius. What was the dodo? If you look at it in its family, it was a pigeon. It was a flightless pigeon that was great, big, and had these giant legs. It must have been delicious. And was eaten to extinction. By the way, there were a whole similar group of birds in Hawaii that were eaten to extinction. So, the Cape of Western South Africa falls into these Mediterranean regions. The Mediterranean regions are beautiful and fascinating. There's some of the best weather in the world. Southwest Australia, where Perth is. Of course, most of coastal California, the Mediterranean basin. A little stretch in coastal Chile, but that's really been heavily impacted by human activity. Okay? So these Mediterranean climate zones are fascinating to work in. So the thing I did at Meadowlark right before I left is I brought in a pretty big gift to build a Mediterranean house there. So it's this really beautiful new little glass house, and it will focus primarily on species from Mediterranean regions of the world. They're great to garden with because they can take a lot of sun, they can take a fair amount of cold, not freezing, but cold, and they're very water thrifty. So, and they're beautiful. So Mediterranean regions are really worth getting to know and look at and travel. All right. And here is Kirstenbosch Botanical Garden in Cape Town, widely regarded as the most beautiful botanic garden by public garden professionals in the world. And it doesn't disappoint. It's pretty incredible. And it is primarily plants that are native to the Cape Province. So South Africa has this fantastic thing called SANBI, the South African National Biodiversity Institute. It's probably one of the best conservation agencies in the world. These guys are the real deal, right? They're managing elephants and lions and aardvarks and these incredible botanical gardens. And if you're in Cape Town, you don't want to miss Kirstenbosch. It is stupendously beautiful, beautifully curated, incredibly diverse. There are just some of the native Nothopias, the aloes there, incredibly colorful, picturesque. And so many of our favorite plants that we buy at the local nursery are South African in origin, to include gladiolas, and agapanthus, and plumbagos. I love that green gladiolas. And a horticulturist working for me at Meadowlark years ago went, I'm going to plant a gladiolus and it's going to be green. I'm like, what? But man, that started to grow and I suddenly realized how ignorant I was. This was this incredibly neat, beautiful gladiolus. All right. Also the proteas and the white arum lilies and flower arrangements, pelargoniums, the thunbergias, these are all really common plants in our horticultural trade. Okay. So, some closing thoughts. Actually, I have several closing thoughts. So here we are in Central Park, where I'm spending a lot of time with my new grandchild, and social media is forbidden. What the parents have said, no social media for the baby. So all these friends of mine are out there having grandchildren, and their grandchildren are all over Facebook. This is friends as close as I can get. Picture of the stroller. It's okay. So there are a couple things going on here that are really interesting. This is Central Park. I cannot imagine what Manhattan must have been like to live in for the native peoples there. A full slate of marine resources, a full slate of freshwater resources, incredibly rich forest. It must have been the Garden of Eden. But here we are today. Humans have been here a long time, but the stone in the back there is all the rock that you see called Central Park, called the Manhattan Schist. It's the rocks down at Great Falls in Virginia are schist rock. These schists are similarly silvery and have beautiful layers, very, very pretty. But we come forward, bang, we're in the Anthropocene. There we go. We have all the Eurasian lilies that are in bloom. And then in the foreground there, we have the ever hideous Japanese knotweed, Polygonum perfoliatum. Whoa. This is one of the most profoundly destructive invasive plants I've ever seen. I've seen it in several parts of the world now. It's a big weed in Asia. There are monocultures of it in my neighborhood of northern Arlington. It grows through rhizomes, right? Any slightly moist setting, it will just take off and choke out virtually everything else. So what are we having here? We're having a weed war. These weeds are going to fight each other for this space. But that said, I have to say that the management I see in Central Park really gives me a lot of faith in what they're doing. They're weeding, they're planting, they have a huge slew of volunteers. It's really, really interesting. But what I mean to say is that natural history interpretation here, I'm saying, is coalescing with all these aspects of science and technology. And the phenomenon, they're manifest uniquely in different areas. But human agency is the driver. We are the driver. So here we are out. You know, I love the world. I'm always trying to get out in it. Had a great time in Africa there. That's in Malawi, Luanda National Park. I wanted to put that I was working with senior citizens there up in the middle and with the Smithsonian. And there I am telling kid stories, so that was good. Had a really good trip to Oman with my oldest daughter, who's an Arabic speaker. I normally don't travel with an interpreter really good at body language. And I know the important things like, is there beer here and where's the bathroom? And then strombolites and thrombolites in Western Australia, up in the upper left-hand corner. And then the extraordinarily biodiverse highland market in Lalibela, Ethiopia, which is absolutely one of the most exotic places I've ever been. Ethiopia was one of those very few countries around the world that was not colonized. The Italians tried, and the Ethiopians took no mercy with prisoners, and they backed out. Thailand was not colonized. Occupied during the war, but it wasn't colonized. These are amazing places when you can visit them. The biodiversity in this market is absolutely phenomenal for plants and animals. I'm very sorry to say that this immediate area has been affected by the current war there involving a province further north called Tigray. So I have two colleagues there that I'm collaborating with. One thing that surprised me when I went there, the bird diversity is phenomenal. And so we were able to hire a local ornithologist, and in 2 days we saw like 110 species of birds. Everything from the tiniest exotic colored passerine to these gigantic Lagermeyer birds that are like a turkey bull. Just incredible. So here are some of the what I call the Anthropocene frontiers of the interpretive continuum. We're still talking about the continuum. We talked about how organismal and molecular biology are changing. The names of many organisms are changing. Taxonomic reviews. The biggest thing going on, obviously, is climate weather, associated drought. Then the genetic advances, CRISPR. Okay, shall we just say all the way out? Clustered, regular, interspersed, palindromic repeats. That'll be on the quiz. But you want to do the whole thing. But if you want to learn about CRISPR, just read up on it. What about AI interpretation? It's not really happening yet, but it is also happening. What about these blasted codes that you use in menus now? You know, you can go to a museum or a public garden now and use that QR code. It'll tell you everything about those South African plants. I don't like it. You should like it. Because we want to be interpreters, right? We don't want the blasted QR code telling the story. And there's no way it's going to tell the story that we're going to tell. I'm just convinced of that. That's the old timer in me. Talk a little bit about invasive species, the extinction crisis, obviously population. Crop diversity is a big deal. And what about GMOs? This is a big deal. And the GMO controversy, my friends, is speeding to your front door right here. Anybody aware of what's happening with that? So there are now, thank you, genetically modified chestnuts being trialed at SUNY in New York. This is an incredibly thorough, detailed scientific effort to reintroduce chestnuts, but they are GMOs. And so the non-GMO community is up in arms about it. The chestnut community, I think, is somewhere in the middle. This was the central tree of importance for this entire ecosystem and ecoregion, and it's coming back. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I just have a brief passage there from my diary in New Delhi. This is the first time I've been to South Asia. Many of you may be retired diplomats, military spies, what have you, and you know, spent interesting time in interesting places around the world. I just couldn't believe New Delhi when I first saw it. I've spent a lot of time in the developing world since then. It was just cacophony beyond my wildest imagination, and it was absolutely, totally, incredibly fascinating. And I thought maybe it looks a little bit like the play looked, and maybe it looks a little bit like the future's going to look in some ways. I can't wait to go back. I haven't been back, and I want to go back. I love I love megacities because they're just so interesting. All right. So we're interpreting the Anthropocene. It's very important to keep up with the news on new scientific discoveries. Here's something that has to do with CRISPR. In Brazil, they are now modifying very destructive armyworms, so the males are not attractive to the females and vice versa. You guys, there's a chance that CRISPR will have some remarkable applications in the next 20 years to kill some of the worst invasive weeds that we see in our forests. What if CRISPR technology could turn off the photosynthetic gene for Japanese stilgrass? And it would just die. That's not impossible. I'm not a geneticist, you guys. But we need to stay up to speed on this because there are some potentially big ramifications. Everything about CRISPR right now has to do with human health, which is certainly as it should be. And it looks like a few diseases are going to be front and center to be targeted. Sickle cell anemia is prominent among them. But the potential environmental implications are very broad. Got to keep up on it. I really urge you as a naturalist, get to know the families of the organisms you're interested in. Because once you know that family and realize some of the other animals and plants that are related to it, it opens up this whole new area of how things are connected. The human family is super interesting. The orchid family, the pea family, very small, odd families out there. The swift family, the apodiform birds, they all share these morphologic, these form characteristics. And so when you look at it and go, whoa, this bird's related to this bird, that's related to this bird, I didn't know that. And it will really open up a lot of information to you for any biological organism. Think about the area you love, the area you want to teach about, and go for it. Obviously, we want to promote ecologically focused gardening, which I'm sure you all are probably doing right now. We want to interpret ecosystems and ecoregions, which we talked about a little bit. Foster conservation everywhere we can. There's all kinds of social and environmental trends happening right now we should pay close attention to. And then pay it forward. If you know a young person, if you you know a talented young student, if you know somebody who's going to go on to do important work in the environment, what can you do to help? So I sponsor a university student in Malawi. It cost me $500 a year to pay his tuition as an undergraduate. And he's studying biology. He's really interested in wildlife biology. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this young person has the tools to move forward and either work as an interpreter, as an educator, as a field biologist, as a researcher, wherever he's going to end up. We need every soldier we can get in the world of conservation. And then lastly there, you know, really interpret for people the idea of the model of landscape ecology and biogeographic understanding. So we're almost done here. I just want to point out that Jill Christensen is one of my favorite scientific illustrators. We talked a little bit about the change of molecular biology coming down the road as opposed to organismal. Birds have had substantial revisions in their genetics and their relationships. It turns out that parrots are much more closely related to falcons than we ever knew. It turns out that eagles are much more closely related to turkey vultures than we ever knew. And this is changing a system of bird taxonomy that's been in place for hundreds of years. It's happening in the plant world too, but it's not quite as pronounced. In the bird world it is. And this was a great article in Scientific American. And what's this guy doing on the right-hand side here? I like the fact he has the time.
Old school.
I'd like to think that he was an interpreter here in Shenandoah, maybe back in, like, you know, the very beginning of the park. Well, he wasn't. He's probably at the forestry section. And he's looking at this American chestnut and going, what chop was being here. And that's what they did. But we have, the chestnut's coming back. We're not quite sure how it's going to work, but it's going to be reintroduced. And that's it. I just appreciate your time and the privilege to be with you today. And I'll let you guys know, I'm sort of undergoing a certain personal change. Maybe it has to do with the fact that I'm a grandparent, I'm not sure. But I'm really getting to the point where I don't want to give talks that much anymore. I want to go to your talks. I want to go to somebody else's talk. I want to sit in the audience and hear what somebody else has to say. And after 40 years, it's weird. I was talking to a good friend of mine. I do some work for the American Horticultural Society. And Holly Shimizu is a board member there. She's the executive director of the U.S. Botanic Garden. We've been friends for a number of years. And I'll be leading 2 trips of them next year, one to South Africa and one to Morocco. They'll both be sort of garden culture focused trips. It'll be a lot of fun. They're crazy expensive. Sorry to tell you that. They pay for mine. But she said to me, she said, you know, I'm ready to sit in the audience and learn from other people. So I'm getting to that stage too. So, a couple of things I just brought with me. I don't always travel with my skulls, but today I did. We all know this one because we all have it, right? Right? Homo sapiens, yeah? You can tell me who this guy is. This is one of my favorites. Very famous. I should say this. Very famous. Who said that? Okay. I'm going to give you my extra copy of The Invention of Nature. Alexander von Humboldt's story. I love that book. Sorry, it's a little marked up. It's sort of a study copy. And then the other related one here, and if you want to, well, I'm going to give it away, but everybody knows this guy. Chimpanzee. Palm troglodytes. My favorite Jared Diamond book is actually not Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's a book, it's the first really big book called The Third Chimpanzee. And it is sort of a survey of what happened, you know, how did humans get to be who we are? And it's an incredible read. It's an absolutely amazing read. So I highly recommend it. Just a few other things. You know, I'm a big field guide enthusiast. I don't endorse any particular field guides, but I use almost anyone that's out there. We do now have our flora of Virginia, but I love the flora of West Virginia. It's the one I grew up with. It's the one I still love. So I always carry it around. when you're out botanizing, particularly in the plant world, you want your field guides, you're working with them. If you get to the point where they're not serving you, go out and buy a flora. And here's the other thing. Now they're all apps. You can just get an app. You don't even have to buy a book. Anyhow, thank you all so much for your attention.
He's going to be here with dinner or lunch or whatever you want to call it. So you can ask him a lot of questions then if you'd like, but let's take a few questions right now. Does anybody have anything you'd like to get answered right away? Go ahead and raise your hand, let me know.
And I'll just hang out up here too.
So Keith, this is a project that our chapter undertook, several members, the Socrates Project, Poisonous Plants, Virginia. I didn't see it in your library there, so we're going to give you that.
Thank you very much.
And one other thing I got to get.
So you guys have worked on this? This is totally cool.
We know you have to be well dressed in South Africa to go digging in the dirt, so we thought this might be appropriate for you as well.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much. Oh, very nice. Look at that. Oh, my daughter's going to be really proud. Thank you guys very much.
We're going to move on. Now, unfortunately, last year for Class 10, we couldn't provide this nice